is, again, very good to be back with you all this morning. And we're on. Good. If you will, meet me in Matthew chapter 5 and drop yourself a marker at Matthew chapter 5, and then join me in the book of James, also in chapter 5. As you're finding two texts in your Bible, I'll ask if you've ever confided in a friend, perhaps a best friend or a brother or a cousin or whoever you're closest with, if you've ever confided about some intention that you had and perhaps they didn't believe you, maybe because they've heard the wind blow before. That's what, some folks have told me before. Or they've heard all these stories so many times before, perhaps a New Year's resolution. It's that time of year, right? When we make resolutions and then we falter on a first real temptation, sometimes we don't really keep our New Year's resolutions, and our friends know what we're really made of. And sometimes our reaction to our friends' amazement or disbelief might be the words, "Well, I swear I'm going to do whatever your intention was," or "I promise," or "I really, really will." This is what we call an oath, right? Well, in our text for today, as we move on through the book of James with the pace of this three-legged sloth, James shows us in our text that there's a better way. There is a confidence that you can express based upon nothing more than your character. And you'll be amazed that today we have only one verse for our text, and it is verse number 12. James says, "But above all things, my brethren, swear not, neither by heaven, neither by the earth, neither by any other oath, but let your yea be yea, and your nay, nay, lest you fall into condemnation." This habit of swearing, taking an oath, making a pledge, we can call it a number of things. This habit of swearing by a multitude of curious objects was very, very common among the Jews. And so James considered it to be essential to provide a warning against this type of oath. And he's giving this warning to Hebrew Christians who had been former participants in this strange Jewish custom. And again, we see James doing what he has so often done, as we saw illustrated in Sunday school yet again. James is repeating the teaching of his elder half-brother Jesus, specifically the teaching of the Sermon on the Mount. James gives us a brief review or a restatement of Christ's teaching. And so go to your bookmark that you've placed in Matthew chapter 5, and we'll read the teachings of Jesus in the sermon. In Matthew chapter number 5, look at verse number 33. Christ is teaching here. He says again, "Ye have heard that it hath been said by them of old time, Thou shalt not forswear thyself, but shalt perform unto the Lord thine oaths. He says, But I say unto you, swear not at all, neither by heaven, for it is God's throne, nor by the earth, for it is his footstool, neither by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. Neither shalt thou swear by thy head, because thou canst not make one hair white or black, or even make one grow." Matt, or Brother Steve. "But let your communication be yea, yea, nay, nay, for whatsoever is more than these cometh of evil." You see, this type of swearing is also known as making a pledge, or we may say it is giving an oath or making a promise. This swearing that James discusses in the section that we've read today, it's not profanity, although profanity should be shunned as well. This swearing that James is telling us to avoid is a practice of regularly confirming your truthfulness by appealing to a higher power. It's the oath. It's the pledge. It is the promise that becomes necessary because you are less than trustworthy. Jesus teaches the same things in Matthew chapter 5. And the main point here of both Jesus' teaching and James's teaching is that we must be so truthful that our yes means yes, and our no means no. And there is no question. There is no contradiction. There is no quivering. Christians should have no need to resort to an oath in order to confirm their truthfulness. The Jews at the time of James's writing used oaths deceptively. They would make an oath in order to deceive someone. Whereas an oath should be used to confirm your truthfulness, they actually used an oath to be more deceptive. Today, Christians use the same thing. We've become guilty of the same tactic, and we've taken the tactics of the world, and we begin to use oaths deceptively as well. And so James underscores now the pitfall of pledges for us, which is my title for today. If you're keeping track of my titles, it is the pitfall of pledges. And James will underscore for us the pitfall of making oaths by telling us that there is a crisis of truth. And to combat the crisis of truth, we must always communicate truth. And when we fail to communicate truth, there is a consequence of our failure to communicate truth. We must be so truthful that everyone knows what we say can always be trusted. James illustrates for us that there is a crisis of truth. We see this in his opening of this verse. There is a command. He says, "But above all things, my brethren, swear not." That's a command, by the way. The command is only necessary because there is a crisis of truth. He says, above all. Above all what? You see, there's two ways to understand this statement against taking an oath. And so we must examine it in its context. The immediate context we understand from the rest of this chapter, verses 1 through 6, suffering under the corrupt extortion of what we learned earlier in this chapter is convicted taskmasters. So you be better than those. You tell the truth. Verses 7 through 11, he tells us to be patient in our trials, to be patient in our temptations. Be patient, he says, unto the coming of the Lord. Be patient because the Lord is coming and the Lord will set things straight. And in verse number 12, he says, now, don't get impatient and swear an oath. That's the immediate context. But there is also in this letter an iterative context. By that I mean a repetition of context, because this is no less than the 6th time James has addressed speech in his letter. 6 times James has addressed our speech in this letter, in this epistle. Consider, just pause for a moment and consider that statement that James in these short 5 chapters in this text it only takes about 4 pages in my Bible, 5 small chapters. James has addressed our speech 6 times. Is there any doubt that one of the primary themes of this letter is to stop sinning with your tongue? Chapter 1, verse number 19. Wherefore, my beloved brethren, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. In verse 26, if any man among you seem to be religious and bridleth not his tongue, he deceives his own heart. This man's religion is vain. We move to chapter 3 in verse number 2. For in many things we offend all. If any man offend not in word, this same is a perfect man, meaning a mature man, and able also to bridle the whole body. We move to chapter 4. In verse number 11, he says, speak not evil one of another, brethren. He that speaketh evil of his brother and judges his brother speaks evil of the law and judges the law. We move to verse 13. He says, go to now, you that say today or tomorrow we will go into such and such a city and continue there a year, buy and sell and get gain. And now we come to chapter 5 in verse number 9. He says, grudge not once again one against another, brethren. Grudge meaning a sigh. And now he comes to verse 12, and he says, but above all things, swear not. There's a crisis today of truth. There's a crisis in every area of life today. From the classroom to the boardroom to the courtroom. Truth is difficult to find. Truth is difficult to discover. And that's why we are so tempted to swear an oath. That's why we are asked to swear an oath, to make a pledge. And James commands here, above all. Clearly, this highlights the importance of integrity, the importance of truth. Speak the truth. That's the command. Why is it so necessary to make such a command? We need to see the custom of the day. Turn with me back to the book of Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, to chapter number 23. Jesus gives us some insight into the custom when he rebukes the Scribes and the Pharisees in Matthew chapter 23. Look with me to verse number 16. Jesus speaks to the Scribes and Pharisees. He says, woe unto you, ye blind guides, which say, whosoever shall swear by the temple, it's nothing. But whosoever shall swear by the gold of the temple, he's a debtor. Ye fools and blind, for whether is greater, the gold or the temple that sanctifieth the gold? And whosoever shall swear by the altar, it is nothing. But whosoever sweareth by the gift that is upon it, he is guilty. You fools and blind, for whether is greater, the gift or the altar that sanctifieth the gift? Whoso therefore shall swear by the altar sweareth by it and by all things thereon. Whoso shall swear by the temple sweareth by it and by him that dwelleth therein. And he that shall swear by heaven sweareth by the throne of God and by him that sitteth thereon. He that shall swear by heaven sweareth by the throne of God and him that sitteth thereon. Woe unto you, Scribes and Pharisees. I'm reading too far there. You see, the Jews here, and especially the leaders of the Jews, these scribes and these Pharisees, had some very strange rules about taking oaths. They had some strange rules about making pledges. They thought that they could swear by some specific things, and each thing that they would swear by would mean something different. And so what they would do is they would make an oath by the gold of the temple, or they would make an oath by the sacrifice on the altar, and the Jews would consider that statement to be legally and morally binding. And they would say, he's a debtor. Or they would say that he is guilty. Why is that? Because they could bring gold into the temple, and they could bring a sacrifice for the altar. But then they would teach that swearing by the temple or by the altar itself was a loophole. Well, I don't own the temple. I can swear by the temple, but it's not mine, so it doesn't mean anything. I mean, I can swear by Brother Roger's farm. I don't own it. It's not mine. It don't mean anything. It's a big loophole, right? So Jesus teaches that this is wrong. He counters this philosophy by saying, anytime you swear by anything, it's always something. It always means something. You see, the Jews would make these little rules, and what they did was they actually created a way for you to be an evasive liar. They created an entire sect of evasive liars. Have you noticed that everybody today wants to parse their sentences? Have you noticed that everybody today is a backroom lawyer? I don't know where you work. I know where I used to work. Everybody is a backroom lawyer. That depends on what your definition of is. Have you heard that? Give me a break. Well, it says may, not shall. Well, it says shall, not must. I mean, give me a break. The primary issue that Jesus is getting at is truthfulness. Jesus connects here in this text, in Matthew chapter 23, he says every oath connects back to its original origin. The gold of the temple is sacred because the temple is sacred. The sacrifice is only sanctified because it's on the altar. Any place else, a dead animal is just a dead animal, right? And so when you swear by heaven, you swear by everything that is in heaven. By the way, God lives in heaven. And so when you swear by heaven, you swear by God. When you swear by anything on earth, the earth is God's. It belongs to him. That was the Jewish custom. They would make these little loopholes. They would make these little laws. And so they thought they would exempt themselves from these oaths. And so making an oath became nothing to them. Now, here's the curiosities. That was their custom. Here's the curiosities. We're not exempt. Do you know that we do the same thing? Really? Do you pinky swear? Cross my heart and hope to die. Really? Do you cross your heart and hope to die? I swear on my mama's grave. What exactly does that mean when you swear on your mama's grave? I mean, okay, anybody ever swore on their mama's grave and then didn't follow through on it? What exactly do you expect to happen if you swear on your mama's grave and then you don't keep that promise? I mean, my daddy's rolling over in his grave, really? If you do that, your grandpa's going to roll over in his grave, really? I ain't ever seen a dead man roll over yet. Do we do the same thing? Well, I promise. Well, this time I really promise. Well, I know, but this time I really, really promise. Well, I really, 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 really promise. Well, how many reallys do you have to really put in front of your really, really, really promise? We do the same thing, don't we? Here's one that I never got. You ever seen an old Western movie? And they take out this really sharp knife and they cut their little thumb. And the other guy takes out his really sharp knife and they cut their little thumb. And then they shake hands and they call it blood brothers. And they always tell the truth. What? I almost hesitate to use this example because it's one that affected me personally. We don't have to follow a federal court injunction because it doesn't apply. It's not a federal mandate. It was a company decision. Really? Here's the point. Don't look at this text where Jesus condemns the Pharisees, or don't look at the text of James where he corrects the first century Hebrew believers and even remotely think that we're exempt. We're exactly the same. We do the same exact thing. And he says, do not swear an oath. Not by heaven, not by the earth, not by any other oath. He says, just let your yea be yea and your nay, nay. That's the correction. So we have some curiosities too, but the correction is all the oaths are based upon the character and the attributes of God himself. That's what Jesus taught. If you swear by the temple, it's God's temple. Matthew 23, verse 21, whoso shall swear by the temple sweareth by it and by him that dwelleth therein. Matthew 5, verses 33 through 37, we read that earlier. To swear by heaven is to swear by God himself. To swear by the earth or anything in the earth is to swear by God's property that you don't own. To swear by your head. the hair that you can't make white, or the hair that you can't make black, or in my case, the hair that you can't make grow, is to be an offense to God's sovereignty. You're not even in control of your hair. This oath meant the same as, I swear by my life. You can't even control the color of your hair. Much less are you in control of your own life. All things are under God's control. All things are owned by God. And so by what can we swear for ourselves? That's James's logic. What can we swear by that we're in control of? And so he says, don't swear at all. Don't make an oath. And so now we have this question of, how do we communicate truth? How should we affirm our communication of truth? Which brings the obvious question of courtrooms, doesn't it? And I mean, that's not out of context either, because if you read verses 1 through verse 11, there's two scenes of a courtroom. Verses 1 through 6 is the condemned criminal standing before the court, hearing his sentence read out. And verses 7 through 11 is the verses that tell us to be patient in tribulation, because our day of justice is coming unto the day of the Lord. And so verse 12 is obviously can be taken within the context of a courtroom. And so should a Christian take an oath of honesty? In a courtroom here in our country, we're asked to swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth. In most cases, some courtrooms vary, most cases they add the phrase, so help you God, to the end of it. And one view of these verses suggests that James' command is, do not promise to tell the truth. Is that correct? I would say that James is very concerned about the integrity of our speech. If you go back just a page or two, James chapter 3, verse 14, James says here, lie not against the truth. Colossians 3, verse 9 says, lie not one to another, seeing you've put off the old man with his deeds. So the New Testament authors are clear that we're not to lie. We're supposed to always tell the truth. Let me remind you that oaths were permitted for the purpose of being a witness. And so even in the context of James chapter 5, if we were to be called as a witness, as is the planter, as are the prophets, as are the patriarchs, if we were called to be a witness, oaths were permitted for the purpose of being a witness. There are many examples in the Old Testament. Let me read for you just one of them from Exodus chapter 22. Exodus chapter 22, verse 10. If a man deliver unto his neighbor an ass or an ox or a sheep or any beast to keep, and it die, or be hurt or driven away, no man seeing it, then shall an oath of the Lord be between them both, that he hath not put his hand to his neighbor's goods, and the owner of it shall accept thereof, and he shall not make it good. That's just but one example in the Old Testament. There are many where an oath could be given to affirm the integrity or to affirm the truthfulness of an action. And so James' teaching here is against the frequency of oaths. He's not prohibiting us from affirming our truthfulness before a court. He's telling us not to be frequent in our pledges. The other question that we often hear is not courtrooms, but it's covenants. We see people making pledges or taking oaths throughout the Bible. And so, is it appropriate for us to make a covenant? Every covenant that you read in the Bible is a promise that God has made. Do you know that God has made oaths? Again, we're not going to turn to these. I will read you a couple of examples. Psalm 110, verse 4, the Lord hath sworn and will not repent. Thou art a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. Hebrews chapter 6. For when God made promise to Abraham, because he could swear by no greater, he sware by himself, saying, surely blessing I will bless thee, multiplying I will multiply thee. What's that? That's a restatement of the Abrahamic covenant, where God made a promise and he swore by himself. The Old Testament custom was that you could swear an oath. Let's turn to a couple of these and read these because we have time. Go with me to Genesis chapter 24. Genesis chapter number 24. This is when Abraham's servant was sent to look for a wife for Isaac. Genesis 24, beginning in verse 1. Abraham was old, well stricken in age. The Lord had blessed Abraham in all things. And Abraham said to his eldest servant of his house that ruled over all he had, "Put, I pray thee, thy hand under my thigh." And that was a symbol of an oath. "And I will make thee swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and the God of the earth, that thou shalt not take a wife unto my son of the daughters of the Canaanites among whom I dwell, but thou shalt go unto my country and to my kindred and take a wife unto my son Isaac." And of course you know the rest of the story. You know how this servant went and found Rebekah. Turn with me to Joshua chapter 2. We'll see another oath. By the way, that oath was blessed. We'll see another blessed oath. You'll be there before me. My pages are sticking together. Joshua chapter number 2. We see an oath, a covenant that's taken between two spies and a lady that lived on the wall of Jericho named Rahab. Verse number 12. "Now therefore I pray you," Rahab is speaking. She says, "I pray you swear unto me by the Lord." In other words, swear unto the Lord. "Since I have showed you kindness, you will show kindness to my father's house and give me a true token. And that you will save alive my father, my mother, my brother, my sisters, and all that they have, and deliver our lives from death." And the men answered her, "Our life for yours, if ye utter not this our business. And it shall be, when the Lord hath given us the land, that we will deal kindly and truly with thee." In other words, they took that oath. They made that promise to her. There's many others. David swore an oath. Samuel swore an oath. Let's see if this bears true in the New Testament as well. Go to Galatians chapter number 1. First chapter of Galatians, we see that Paul, who swore oaths several times, he swears one here in Galatians chapter 1. Verse number 20, he says, "Now the things which I write unto you, behold, before God I lie not." That sounds like an oath, doesn't it? I'm promising you unto God that I'm telling you the truth. Back up with me to Acts chapter 21. The 21st chapter of Acts. We see Paul has sworn an oath when he defended his testimony to the Galatians, and now when he's resolving conflict in Jerusalem in chapter 21. We won't read all of this, just look to verse number 22. Right before his arrest, he says, "What is it therefore? The multitude must needs come together, for they will hear that thou, Paul, art come. Do therefore this, that we say to thee, we have 4 men which have a vow on them," an oath. "Take them and purify thyself with them, and be at charges with them, that they may shave their heads, and all may know that those things whereof they were informed concerning thee are nothing. But that thou thyself also walkest orderly and keepest the law. As touching the Gentiles which believe, we've written and concluded that they observe no such thing, save only that they keep themselves from things offered to idols, and from blood, and from strangled, and from fornication." That's a review of Acts 15. "Then Paul took the men, and the next day, purifying himself with them, entered into the temple to signify the accomplishment of the days of purification, until that an offering should be offered for every one of them." And so we see here Paul has taken a vow. He's taken an oath to resolve a conflict in Jerusalem. And so what do we see? I mention all of these oaths, all of these vows, only to say that James is not only teaching us against the frequency of oaths, he's making us aware that it is wrong to make frivolous oaths. Only enter into a pledge when it is absolutely necessary and when it is serious. Don't make oaths frequently, and don't make oaths frivolously. And that brings us to the third point, which is the consequences of the truth. The consequences of not being truthful. You see, James in our text in chapter 5, verse number 12, he gives us a caution. There's a great seriousness in making oaths. Above all things, the seventh time now that he's addressed sins of the tongue. Above all things, my brethren, swear not, neither by heaven, neither by earth, neither by any other oath, but let your yea be yea, your nay, nay, lest. Here's the contrast. Lest you fall into condemnation. That's the great seriousness of making oaths. The prohibition is against frivolous, frequent, flippant pledges. Anytime we make an oath, it should be serious. It should be very seldom. It should be very thoughtful. Unless, he says here, you enter into condemnation. And so James says, don't swear to any oath unless you fall into condemnation. If you make an oath and then you fail to keep it, God will judge those words. There is surely more difficulty for not keeping an oath than there is for not making the oath in the first place. That's the problem of our communication. You see, sometimes we try to bargain with God. And remember, the context here is that someday these oppressive taskmasters will be judged. And in God's mind, verses 1 through 6, they're already judged. In verses 7 through 11, he says, you be faithful, you be patient in the trials and the tests and the temptations. Verse 12, do not swear an oath. You know what the temptation really is here? Oh God, if you'll take this thing off of me, I'll do anything, right? Really? God, if you'll just remove this terrible burden, I'll move to Africa. Pack your bags. Well, you just might have to pack your bags. God, if you'll give me a new car, I'll never complain again. I hope you have never said that. God, if you'll give me a set of wheels, I'll never complain about my car ever breaking down. You know a bicycle's a set of wheels? It is. Did you know that your little Red Ryder wagon is a set of wheels? I mean, be careful how you make oaths, because sometimes you might have to keep an oath and you don't know how God might just fulfill that bargain you made. That's the temptation that James is warning against. I mean, read this in context. It's the oppressive taskmaster. It's your judgment, your justice day is coming. But in the meantime, don't make a frivolous, above everything else, don't swear an oath. Jesus was very clear in Matthew chapter 5. Let your communication be yea, yea, nay, nay, for whatsoever is more of these cometh of evil. Let me remind you, Deuteronomy 23:21. When thou shalt vow a vow to the Lord thy God, thou shalt not slack to pay it. For the Lord thy God will surely require it of thee, and it would be sin in thee. Ecclesiastes 5, verse 4. When thou vowest a vow to God, defer not to pay it, for he hath no pleasure in fools. Pay that which thou hast vowed. That's James's caution on our communication. You know why he gives us that? Character. It's all about our character. Ultimately, James's instruction is to be truthful as a matter of character. He's addressing the issue of our integrity. If you have to swear, in order to affirm you're telling the truth, then do you need to swear all the time? If you have to swear in order for people to know that you're not lying to them, then when do you ever have to not swear? The sky is blue. Or when you have to use a promise, when you have to use an oath all the time, then what about the times when something's just not important at all? If you have to use a promise or an oath all the time, then what about the times when something is really, really, really super important? How do people trust your word at all? What about the last time something was kind of important and you had to swear, really, really, really swear, no, really swear, and now something this time that you weren't expecting was more important than the last time, and now it's even more important, and it's even bigger, and it's even more catastrophic, and you ran out of things to swear by. Because last time you said, swear to God. Oh, I swear to heaven. You said, cross my heart and hope to die, and that was the biggest thing you knew. I swear on a whole stack of Bibles. Well, this is even more important than that, so now what you got left to swear by? That's the issue. You see how this cycle goes, and it just grows, and it's unrelenting, and it gets bigger and bigger and larger and larger. And so do you promise? Do you really promise? Do you really, really promise? Will you pinky swear? Will you swear on your mama's grave? Will you swear on a stack of Bibles? Will you swear by the church house? Will you swear by God himself? And so James says the same thing that Jesus says. Let your yes mean yes. And let your no mean no. And yes doesn't mean yes today and I'll think about it later. And no doesn't mean no today and beg me later. And no doesn't, I'm going to meddle. No doesn't mean go ask your mama and go see grandma. And yes doesn't mean yes today and then go talk to the other parent and pit the parents against each other and pit the grandparents against each other and pit the grandparents against the parents and pit the step-parents against the parents and the step-grandparents against. I'm done meddling now. Yes means yes. No means no. And your words mean what you said your words meant. And if you weren't sure, get sure before you speak, not after you speak. I learned that lesson recently. I'll give you the details later. Do you remember the words? Remember the phrase, a man's word is his bond? I do. Granddad taught me that. Not my grandpa, my great-grandpa. I knew my great-grandpa for a while. A man's word is his bond. Did you shake on it? You know what? I remember in my life, I probably wasn't even Corbin's age. Maybe I was Corbin's age, maybe a little bit younger. You didn't have to shake on it because nobody asked you if you shook on it. Did you say you were going to do it? You're going to do it. Did you say you weren't? Then you weren't. It wasn't too long ago you didn't have to shake on it. But the problem is, in our society, it used to be a man's word was his bond, and then people started breaking their word, and so you had to shake on it. And people never went back on a handshake. And then a handshake wasn't good enough anymore. And so people had to sign a document. They had to sign a contract. And now, if it isn't written down and signed by both parties, it didn't happen. If it's not written, it didn't happen, right? And James is addressing here the issue of integrity. And here's what it comes down to ultimately. You, the child of God, made in the image of God, to reflect the character of God. You should be trusted because you said it, not because you swore to it, not because you shook on it, not because you signed for it. Anything more than yes or no is setting yourself up for judgment, and it's setting yourself up for failure. And too often such oath swearing comes as a response of deep emotion. It's the deep emotion of being under the taskmaster. It's the deep emotion of waiting for your temptation and your trial to be resolved and your justice day coming. That's the first two sections of this chapter. And sometimes we try to make a deal with God to relieve some trial, relieve some testing. I mean, perseverance in trials is the one theme of James. And he says, don't make a rash pledge in your impatience to relieve some trial. So instead of swearing, he says, pray in your difficulty and praise in your delight. By the way, if you read ahead, praying in difficulty and praising in delight is the next theme. That's his next subject. Don't swear a pledge, praise and pray. Gordon Clark says this: since God is truth, a contempt for truth is equally a contempt for God, and none of us want to be in contempt of God. Each child of God needs to be a person whose yes means yes and whose no means no. And so don't fall into the pitfall of pledges. Rather, be a person of integrity. And in your house, in your school, in your office, in your courtroom, in your boardroom, in your influence, there should never be a crisis of truth. Yes is yes, and no is no, and there is no pitfall, no need for pledges and oaths. That's a challenge, isn't it? It's a challenge for me. I hope each of us understands not to swear oaths, but to be persons of integrity, persons of character, based upon the character of God. Let's stand.